So, hello everyone. My name is Karina Urquhart and I'm the Executive Director at BIC, or Book Industry Communication, as it's also known, and your host for this BIC Brunch session today, which is on the subject of rights as a key part of the publishing value chain and is kindly sponsored by FADEL. It's great to see so many of you attending from both the UK and also internationally. And the hashtag for this event, if you'd like to go on to Twitter and join the conversation there, is #BIC Brunch. So just some housekeeping before we get started. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. So once all the speakers have spoken, please use the question box that you should be able to see on your. There should be a little toolkit to one side of your screen in GoToWebinar. The event is being recorded for BIC to use in our marketing and to allow people who can't attend today to still enjoy the event later on. So it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. We'll send you the links, or that you'll see the links in a minute. And just to say as well, attendees won't be identified in the recording. So just to put your minds at rest. Finally, a gentle reminder that BIC is a neutral membership organisation, and as such, we politely ask that that all attendees and all speakers strictly avoid any comments, conversations, or questions that might be considered commercially sensitive or anti-competitive. So, what is a BIC brunch? Many of you will have been to a BIC brunch before, but for those of you that haven't, in summary, they're informal. They're a series of short live online events that focus on a particular supply chain topic with industry expert speakers as well. They're all recorded and they're shared to our YouTube platform, the link for which is on your screen there. We'll be sharing all the slides later on our website, and if you're an attendee today, we'll be emailing them to you as well. So if you don't get a chance to make a note of all the links, they are long, I appreciate that. Don't worry, you'll get that information anyway later on. So here's the running order for today's session. Including the sponsors for the event, we have in total 3 speakers today as follows. So we'll be starting with Paul Gore, EVP and General Manager, Professional Services at FADEL, followed then by Amy Joyner, Rights and Licensing Director at Kogan Page, and last but by no means least, Clare Hodder, Director at RightsZone. Then, as I've said before, there'll be a question and answer session, and then we will be aiming to wrap up by 3:30. So BIC, who are we? Some of you will already know who we are, but for those of you who don't, please bear with me. So BIC is a UK-based, not-for-profit members organisation at the heart of the book industry, creating standards, best practices and resources that very likely already form part of the DNA of your supply chains, helping organisations become more efficient, save money and become less wasteful and ultimately greener. We hold a unique position of trust, facilitating UK and international industry-wide collaboration to reach agreement on dependable standards and best practice in the supply chain. How do we do this? Well, we do it in a variety of ways, including running 5 strategic committees focusing on metadata, digital, physical books, green supply chain, and the library sector. We offer training, events and workshops and execute supply chain related projects for and on behalf of our membership and the wider industry. We also operate 3 industry recognised accreditation schemes. Find out more on our website, the link for which is there on the screen. So back to the purpose of today's session. I'm sure many of you will realise this already, but it might be argued that everything the book industry does ultimately stems from rights, or the permission to sell or license. This BIC brunch will focus on the basics and definitions of rights management. What do we mean by rights? What are the different types of rights that exist in the book and content ecosystem? and what impact do they have on the supply chain and on maximising sales and new streams of revenue? And how can organisations or individuals even begin to know if or where the right permissions are in place? As you can imagine, there's a lot to cover, and so without further ado, I'm going to now hand over to Paul Gore. As I've said, he's the EVP and General Manager at FADEL, and Paul will first of all introduce FADEL as the event sponsor for a couple of minutes, and then begin his presentation, which will give an overview of the rights ecosystem, looking at different models, transactions and scenarios. So over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you very much, Karina, and thanks to BIC. I'm FADEL, speaking for FADEL, where we're really pleased to have the opportunity to sponsor the webinar for rights and the publishing value chain. This is near and dear to us as a R&R, rights and royalty platform that's been serving the publishing industry for well over a decade, as well as working with some of the largest global publishers in US and Europe and beyond. We understand very well how important it is to have discussions about rights, how rights and standards against rights are can be managed or can be managed well within the industry, and there's a lot of room for all of us to take this to the next level. So, but as FADEL, we try to be very active with the industry groups, including BIC, and we're happy to support any communications and standards development along with our colleagues in the industry around rights and royalties. So thank you. Next slide. So FADEL's solutions do span all aspects of rights and royalties. We have, of course, rights management with royalty accounting. That's the typical author payout. We have rights sales management or sub-rights sales management. We have a platform for rights and permissioning for things like education publishers who need to clear rights. And we have a statement portal to get information out to the authors in a nice and a clean way that's GDPR compliant. So beyond this, FADEL has other platforms that are focused on asset and asset level rights. We do serve multiple industries beyond publishing, although publishing is is one of our core industries that we support. So thank you for letting us sponsor today. Okay, next slide. Okay, so you can go to the next slide too. So for the rights ecosystem, one more. Next slide, thank you. So with the rights ecosystem, we're going to talk about a number of aspects of how rights are managed at publishers and some of the issues around the rights at publishers. And from some of the other discussions we've had, we've had a number of inputs about rights. So from a publisher's perspective. So the first points are, most important is why should we care about rights? Okay, and we've heard statements such as, we're basically not in the book business. I know we produce books, but we're actually in the rights business. We have licensing, and licensing out provides alternate routes into the market, and literally everything we do as publishers derives from the rights. So really everything is about the rights. The rights are there from the inception of the deal, and from that point of licensing the book, from the initial publisher. So, I mean, how do rights work? Typically, you need to have the rights in order to produce the books. So you need to establish that IP or the rights that that you've acquired, and that's typically done through your contract or through your deals. And anyone can acquire the rights. It can be editors for foreign publishers, academics looking for course materials, journalists, software developers, film producers, etc. And the way we talk about rights, and you'll see some of the terminology I'll use today will be, the notion of rights in, which is the acquisition of rights, versus rights out, which is the licensing of rights. So it's two directions of it's the buying and selling of rights, so to speak. And it's really important for all of us over time to establish a clean rights vocabulary that covers the intellectual property, things like exclusivities, restrictions, and that we're using the same terminology from one publisher to another. So as well as within the agencies and in the industry in general. So how do we manage rights? Obviously, it's wise to get a rights system in place, keep track of all the data that you have related to rights so that you can leverage it. You want to include your details on submissions and rejections for all the deals that you're making, and be able to look at your data to make better decisions. On the acquisitions and targeting what you want to license out. So next slide, please. So what I'll be going through today is I'll talk about rights as a foundation for publishing. I'll talk about the contracts and deals, the products that you create, other content in the products that must align to the rights, how knowing your rights is going to support downstream uses of those rights, and how licensing is much more than found money, and that your well understood and well managed rights are actually an asset to the business. So next slide, please. And next slide. So in terms of the the first part of this is that, what is a right, and how are rights represented? The idea here is that, the main ingredients of rights are going to cover things such as for a particular intellectual property, or for the content or assets that go into a property or into a book or a published product. You've got to answer a few questions. First, how can I use this? So, can I produce in different products in different formats if it's an intellectual property, if it's a book or work that I've licensed, or if it's content or assets, I may have specific information about them that govern how I can use it. For example, can it be placed on the cover? Can it be in the body of the text? Is there limitations as to what other types of images or items it can be used next to or as part of? So the second big question is identifying how are you allowed to change an IP once it's been licensed to you. In other words, if you've licensed the work, can you derive other IP from this work? Can you do adaptations, translations to other languages, etc.? Or in the case of content or assets, can you alter it? Can you edit the asset? Can you crop it or make other adjustments to it, or must you use it exactly as is? So these elements of have to be identified as part of the licensing process, or as part of understanding what rights you have. And then, of course, the more common items are, where can I use the rights? In what regions, territories, provinces, countries, states can this IP or assets be used? How can I sell it? So are we restricted to certain channels of sales? Are there only certain markets that are allowed to use these particular properties or works or assets? And is there a time frame? Finally, is there a time frame of when I can use this? What's my what's my expiration date? How long am I licensed to use this? So by first identifying whether we're working with an idea or work or an article, or whether we're working with the content on the interior, we've got to answer these basic questions. How do I use my rights? How do I change it? Where? And how can I sell it? And when can I use it? This really becomes the ingredients that you have that define what your rights are. So next slide, please. Okay. Thank you. I don't know if, so within the licensing life cycle, what you typically are going to have is, and sorry, did you skip a slide, Karina? Okay, go ahead. Thank you, that's the one.
Oh, sorry, Paul.
That's okay.
Throwing you off there. There we go.
No problem.
Is that better?
Perfect. Thank you. So one way of looking at those different rights elements that we were talking about earlier might be, for this example, would be a typical trade publishing type rights model. You might identify, that you have different works or maybe product families that may be called, but what is the work? And in this particular case, there may be a title that's called The History of the Screw, as part of the Tiny Green Mysteries imprint. So, and that's the one that we're talking about. And you may have multiple formats or rights. So we're allowed to print all formats, and we're allowed to do ebooks, but we do not have rights to audio. And we have rights in Canada and USA, and we have rights to sell it direct or through special markets, and only in English. So in a sense, by having a well-structured model of what your rights ingredients are, you can then start to identify which are those rights that you have. And then for each of those combination of rights, you should be able to set things like, what are the dates that I'm eligible for it? Are there fees or payment schedules related to these particular rights? Are there exclusivities or holdbacks or other elements that are tied into it? So I'm ready for the next slide. Okay. Go ahead, one more. So in terms of rights transactions, so now the idea is that, to put it into big context, so we have our set of rights. We can buy or sell them, right? And what you're typically doing is, for the rights that you're bringing in, for example, you sign an author agreement, you're going to acquire rights from the author, and you're going to ultimately pay royalties out to the author. And then and that creates an inventory, so to speak, of rights. Now that may be the same thing for assets for the interiors as it would be for the IP itself or for the work itself. And you can also license those rights or license sub-rights to those assets or portions of it, or excerpts from it. And that may be things like permissioning of text that you may do, at which point, or sub-right sales, at which point you would receive royalties or permissioning payments related to that. So the idea here is that you can connect the rights to the financial transactions that are related to the rights, as well as creating an inventory, so to speak, of what rights you have available to leverage for different purposes. Okay, next slide, please. So, to put an example up here, there's a particular example we have, which is, you may have a book deal that you've signed with a novelist, between a novelist and his publisher, to produce a pair of books. It may have elements such as, there's an advance on signing, along with additional advances for milestones such as manuscript acceptance or upon publication. The publisher may be given permission to produce hardcover, mass, and ebooks and sell in the US and Canada in English only. So these would be the terms that are in the contract itself. There'd be a royalty established. There may be things like escalations or escalations within a title, within a specific ISBN as specified. There would also be terms related to subrights, so that perhaps there's a subright terms that say that subrights are going to be split with the author. And there may be things like bonuses or other things involved. And contracts can get fairly complex. So if this is the second or third contract with this author, there may be things like, we're going to say this won't earn out until all the other contracts earn out, so that they're jointly accounted, across multiple contracts. So all of these items that are examples are elements that might need to be accounted for that affect the rights and affect the transactions related to rights. Next slide, please. So, and as mentioned, contracts can be quite complex, and it's really it's the imagination of our editorial teams is quite good. So their contracts can be quite complex, and sometimes there's very special deals that are put in place to reflect special arrangements with authors or with agencies. We'll go quickly through to the next slide. So at the end of the day, what you actually are creating is rights transactions. And one of the ways to look at this is that you're essentially creating a deal. And what a deal is it says, well, I'm either acquiring or licensing rights in or out. And when I'm acquiring rights, I can be acquiring them from one or multiple rights holders. So maybe a one author deal, maybe a multi-author deal, or I may be licensing it out to another party. And when I do these deals, I identify all the rights that are related to the deal. What are the IPs, their assets? What are the product types, formats, what channels, territories, dates, etc. Okay, and then I tie in all the various deal terms to the rights, to the transaction itself. So things like fixed fees, advances, royalty calculation, allocation rules, special terms, all of that gets identified ultimately as part of this deal. And as a package, that deal reflects cleanly the rights that you've acquired. And typically these deals, whether they're licensed rights in or rights out, have a type of a workflow where there may be a request, some reviews that go on, a drafting of an agreement through approvals where, ultimately once it's approved, it gets executed and finalized between the publisher and the other entity, and and then the cycle can repeat itself through amendments to deals or updates that happen over time, where it goes back into the draft, approve, execute mode. Next slide, please. So, and we're going to go quickly through this, and we'll leave this deck with the group so that people can review this at their leisure. But the basic notion here is that, the concept of your rights in gets you from establishing your rights all the way through to making the payments based on the sales against them. Let's skip this in the next slide. Okay, the same thing on the reverse side and the next slide. And what I'm going to talk about is, next slide, please, is different scenarios where rights is in fact the core component for publishers. And let's go to the next slide. And we'll talk in this case about how rights are used for how the rights acquisition fuels the development of the books and the products. We'll talk about content permissioning, how you extend the reach via licensing, as well as other aspects, including usage models and financials. So next slide, please. So this core example is really the typical publishing arrangement. It's you have a rights acquisition. So you establish an author agreement where a publisher agrees to convert a work or IP, the ideas, into products, i.e. books. So you license the work in order to create the particular books for the author. And the publisher leverages their market expertise and influence to maximize the sales. That's the nature of the transaction that's taking place. So in these cases, the publisher acquires rights to create different types of products. It's not necessarily the acquisition of the products, it's the acquisition of the right to create the product. And then the authors and their agents grant those rights based on the types of product that a particular publisher creates and the markets they serve. So in some cases, with the large publishers, an author may grant wide rights to the publisher because the publisher can handle the introduction of that product into multiple markets. But they may hold, but with a smaller publisher or with a more of a specialty publisher, they may only grant certain territories or certain types of rights, and then work with other publishers to grant other types of rights. That's really between the authors, their agents, and the publishers. So in all these cases, the rights and the compensation for the rights needs to be flexible to account for both the traditional model, which has a lot of variation in it, as well as some of the emerging business models that are happening in publishing. So, and there also needs to be care taken because complex deals, and I'll say in quotes, special deals, can quickly overwhelm the support groups, the royalty groups, the rights teams, so that really having consistent rights management, automation, and standards in place will take a lot of the friction out of that to make it easier for a publisher to understand what rights they have and then how to do things with those rights later. Next slide, please. So kind of tacking in more to the interiors, there's also a huge benefit of having rights awareness related to the content selection. So if you're putting content into a larger product, then knowing your rights of your content and managing that really well can help you achieve a much better compliance so that the products that you're creating contain images or charts or text that have been properly licensed, so that you know what rights you have, you know how they're defined, you know your quantity limitations, and it's connected through your supply chain operations. So you're not printing books where you don't have the rights for the images in those books, for example. So the whole idea here is that having a rights managed process at the core will protect the product from misuse, so from having misused content. Another key aspect is if you know the connection between the products you create and the content that make it up, as well as, of course, the rights behind it, then it makes it possible to improve your discoverability where used, maximize the reuse, and minimize costs. So you don't have to acquire new components if you've actually already have them. And this also converts with some automation in place. This can convert the speed to market, because if you're clearing rights as you select them, as opposed to clearing rights after the fact, you can cut a lot of lead time out of the development of product. Also by moving the clearance earlier, there is a cost reduction because it opens up an opportunity to reuse rights that you have that haven't been fully leveraged, and eliminate unnecessary licensing of rights for things that you choose to use that that have enough quantity for you to use, etc. So these are there's been some return on investment studies, and there's some very big savings related to this for publishers that manage a lot of content, interior content, into their products. Okay, next slide, please. So, again, having rights awareness is also the key to coming up with new products for new markets. And publishing is changing, and there are new ways of getting the product out to the market. Having an awareness, being able to put your hands on those rights is really key to that, because if you don't, then you may have a great idea, but now you have to review 2,000 contracts to see if you can actually leverage that idea if you haven't captured the rights up front. So, so the idea here is to capture those rights in a way that you can start to use that as part of the ideation process. So, and also armed with rights information, your sales and rights licensing folks can listen to customers in the marketplace and come up with variations on the original product, maybe something that wasn't anticipated in the original deal. So, but as long as do you have flexibility to create a new product? Did your contract include rates for this? Do you have a way to respond to opportunities with the authors to create these arrangements? Okay, next slide. So, and of course, you also want to extend your reach via licensing or subrights. Really it's a very basic principle here, but you can maximize your sales just by knowing where you haven't exploited the rights. And publishers owe it to themselves and to their authors to know where these holes are, so that they're trying to get the product into all the places that they've been trusted to sell into. So, and part of this is also preventing sales where the permissions are not in place. And that's also, unfortunately, a common occurrence where if there isn't a good awareness of rights, sometimes rights are sold into territories that they're not allowed to be sold into. So, and also the rights that you sell do need to be aligned so that you can allow the income to pass all the way back to the participants, back to the authors, based on the rates that you have with them, and that you can accurately track it all, from one end to the other. And and having this information available gives you the opportunity to have alerts, so you can see if there's been any violations or things that need to be, where you need to seek permission from the authors, or to deal with extra territories, or if there's incomplete or inaccurate transactions. So the idea here is knowing your rights makes it possible to fully develop your channels. Next slide, please. Okay, and there are some emerging scenarios that are coming up to most publishers in time, which is usage models and subscription. It has its own set of challenges and emerging best practices that are coming out from that. So you need to know, for example, whether your existing contracts grant you the rights to include products in a subscription, or how they can be included in it. You need to define compensation models that govern how the authors are paid. You have to determine how to manage your usage for subscription products so that you can do the necessary calculations, and ultimately produce royalty statements that connect the subscription sales to the products that you have licensed, so that you make the connection between the two, and you have transparency back to the author. This is an area that authors are concerned with. They want to make sure that they're properly compensated as part of this. Next slide, please. And then ultimately, rights also ultimately tie into financials. So we know that generally rights revenue tends to carry a higher gross profit, just due to the lower cost of goods. So it's got a positive effect on P&Ls, and rights carry an asset value. So if you have a publisher that's acquired, or being acquired, or looking to acquire, then knowing what rights the company is holding in its portfolio can really increase the valuation. It factors right into that for the publisher. And as well, the rights revenue can contribute to advance earnouts on your portion of your title P&Ls, and they can help reduce write-offs on those advances. Next slide, please. One more slide. So just in summary, for the publishing industry, some of these focus areas are, one of the main themes here is to simplify. Rights and royalty terms at publishers are frequently more complex than necessary. So, it's publishers should be simplifying as much as possible. And many publishers have multiple systems in place to manage this, which exponentially increases the level of complexity and the potential for inconsistency. The next point is to focus on standards, because having rights or metadata standards enables clear communications. So that's not only things like statement standardization, but it means that what you call your rights and how you manage your rights from one end to another inside your organization is critical. But as well, bring your work, your own publisher's work, to BIC, so that within BIC you can start to establish standards that will work across publishers. Our experience, just in this, as a service provider into the industry, is that we see differences in almost every publisher we face. So, there's a lot of room as an industry to have standards here that benefit everyone. And then finally, think out of the box. Publishing is no longer just books. Our whole world is evolving, and we need to look forward at new business models, new ways of interacting, and that really means that we need to get our standards in place to reduce the friction on the work that we do, so that we can actually focus on the real work, which is developing the new business models, or developing, maximizing the models that we have. I think that's it. Karina? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Paul. Just a couple of observations, if I may. Yeah, it's interesting what you were saying about books or content, because it's not always necessarily a physically printed book, and it's not always necessarily an ebook either. There are other content formats available, but whatever format it takes, it's ultimately a manifestation of the rights and the licensing. It's almost like it's an output of that agreement that's taken place prior.
Yes.
So yeah, interesting. And so so thank you for taking us through a whistle stop tour, I think.
Yes.
I get the feeling you could have talked for a lot longer on the licensing and the rights life cycle, the ecosystem and its complexities, and it is a very complex area, as we're going to find out a bit more, I think, from our next speaker. So thank you for that, Paul, and we look forward to the Q&A session later. So next, I'm going to invite, and she's already here, which is brilliant, is Amy. So second speaker today is Amy Joyner, Director of Rights and Licensing at Kogan Page. Amy's going to talk to us today about the rights from the perspective of a publisher. We're going to hear about a wide variety of topics, covering the acquisition, exploitation and protection of rights, future-proofing, rights selling in practice and reasons for selling in the first place, and the importance of systems and standards. So over to you, Amy. Let me just get your slides up on screen. There we go.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much to BIC for having us today. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Kogan Page. So if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please, Karina. Hopefully some of you will know Kogan Page already. We are a global independent business book publisher. We've been going for 55 years. We publish for the trade, for students, and for professionals in industry, all in business subjects. We're an active member of the IPG, the Independent Publishers Guild in the UK, and also the UK's Publishers Association. And we've been awarded Business Book of the Year in 2019, and we've won industry awards for our books, our accessibility, and our metadata. So what qualifies me to talk about rights? At the risk of dating myself, this is my 20th year in publishing. I've had the pleasure of working for McGraw-Hill, Oxford University Press, Pearson, and now here at Kogan Page. I'm an author of one of the IPG's courses on rights, and I was one of the founding members of the Publishing Licensing Services Rights Management Group, which I'm going to mention a little bit more about the resources they offer later. So as Paul and Karina have mentioned, my role encompasses all rights, everything from acquisition right the way through to selling, and that includes training editorial, and others on rights acquisition, through to selling the subsidiary rights as well as protection. And I've implemented 2 new rights systems at the publishing houses that I've worked for. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Karina, I'll talk a bit more about selling and protecting our rights. So Karina and Paul have both touched on the fact that IP is really the foundation of our industry. And Paul's spoken really well about how the intellectual property rights fit into the kind of publishing ecosystem and the structure. And I'm going to talk a bit more on what rights sellers are actually doing with rights and how we go about selling subsidiary rights. I'm biased, but we have the best job in the business, and I'm going to explain a bit more why. We work with editorial to establish what we're going to sell as our main product. So that could be the print book, the e-book, the audio book, that could be content being used in subscription services. We'll establish, first of all, what's going to be sold as our primary product. And of course, you can't sell what you don't own, as Paul's already touched on. So doing that clearance up front allows you many more opportunities downstream. So on the slide here, I've got an example of one of our books, which is the print format, the audio book, and then you can see some of the translations that we sold sub-rights to. The value of your business is in the value of your IP. So everything you own is an asset and will increase the value of your company. Do you confidently know what assets you own? We did a straw poll at the IPG some years ago to talk about how many people in the room could confidently state what content they owned, including anywhere that they had licensed content in or licensed content out. And of course, the answers to those were few and far between. There were not many people who could confidently say, yes, we could run a report and say, this is the number of licenses we've got, this is the content that we absolutely confidently know we own and we could do things with. And then once we've established what we're going to sell as our primary product, we move on to what will be sold as subsidiary rights or sub-rights. And then we'll go about exploiting those subsidiary rights. So that could be in the form of collective licensing, translation rights sales, reprint rights, where you would license English language rights to a different territory, and it would be sold as a different product. Maybe an adaptation. That could be a localized version with local case studies. And of course, granting permission, so giving people permission to use your content in their product. Other rights, audiobook licensing, digital licensing, summary rights sales, that could be merchandising, dramatization, film rights, broadcast rights. The options are limitless. And of course, with the rise of technology, content is being used in different ways by different people. So it's our job as publishers to really make sure where's our audience and where are we finding opportunities for licensing. For anybody interested, this is a great book about Amazon and about how they've revolutionized e-commerce, both before, during and after the pandemic. And of course, vital to all of this is really determining what's your strategy going to be for acquiring, for selling and protecting your rights. Are you going to proactively respond to infringements to protect your content, or will you have a strategy to kind of protect those up front? It's really important that the whole company is involved. So we'll cover that a bit later on as well. So if we could move to the next slide. Here we talk about how we actually go about rights selling. We work with everybody across the business. We work with editorial, marketing, sales, production, finance. There are very few departments that a rights team doesn't get to interact with. And we also go out into different markets. So we have a really good view on kind of global trends, who the key players are in markets, what's selling, what doesn't sell. In order to actually sell rights ourselves, we'll focus on a variety of different activities, and this will range from marketing. So that could be anything from social media, direct email campaigns, face-to-face meetings, Skype meeting, well, I say Skype, that dates me, online meetings, and of course, book fairs. Book fairs are a key driver in rights selling, and a lot of activity will hang around those book fairs. So I've listed some of the book fairs here, but this is by no means an exclusive list. There are hundreds of book fairs every year. And the rights teams are the ones that you'll see on the stands, in the agent centres, sat head down, having meetings every half an hour, usually across multiple days. In terms of the sales process really starts with the marketing, and then it'll extend into giving people options to view that content, whether that's a full manuscript, a title information sheet, it could be a sample chapter, it could be a proposal document, whatever you've got to allow somebody to take a view on, will this be content that is suitable for us? Then you start giving them an option, a window of opportunity to have a look at whether they want to publish that content. They make a decision, and then you move to negotiation and contract stage. We do this in a variety of different ways. The most successful rights sellers will focus on their types of content and really match that content with the appropriate partner. So they'll really think about what interested parties do we have, how do we market to them most appropriately. And you tend to have quite a strategic approach for new editions, same authors, and really kind of think about how do we build not just that one project, but how do we build that kind of author brand. We also have the joy of informing authors when we've sold rights, which they love. And of course, we provide a great service for authors. We'll negotiate the full kind of licensing fees. We'll do all the paperwork. We'll be able to service those contracts, providing any additional materials that are needed, including increasingly marketing support, being able to build on our authors' own social media channels, being able to create bespoke content for marketeers. And then it's really important at the other end of the spectrum to be collecting all the money. So collecting any advance payments or flat fees, collecting royalties, really important to ensure that the kind of finance end doesn't fall off, because of course that's the reason we're doing it. There's also a customer service element in rights, really looking at your speed of response, looking at how you respond to customers, the knowledge of what rights and what products you own. And the most effective rights teams that I've worked in have a really good feedback cycle with the rest of the business. So this is really talking to the rest of the business about what's selling where, which genres are popular in certain territories, what strategies lead to successful sales, and building a relationship with the finance team to recognise, allocate income appropriately, be able to budget, be able to meet your financial commitments to the rest of the business. If we could have the next slide, please. So why do we do all this? Paul touched on this earlier, but rights income is bottom line revenue. Bar the author's share, it's all pure profit. It also allows us to extend both our authors' reach and their brand, as well as our reach and our brand, into markets, into areas that we wouldn't be able to get to ourselves. Either we don't have English language sales capability there, or more likely local readers want to read in their own language. And I have had many instances in the past where both the translation and the English language book can sell very nicely alongside one another. So that's not always the competition that perhaps some sales teams would have you believe. It also allows us a window into having a look at the performance of our genres worldwide. So are the topics of interest the same in Brazil? Why is Poland see a rise in certain areas? Why is that author suddenly gaining followers in China? And what are the larger macro trends that are driving all of this? So this helps to inform both our rights selling strategy as well as our commissioning strategy, and of course our kind of conversations with authors and our understanding of how their books are performing. It can also be the forerunner to English language sales, so really understanding markets and territories and really have the knowledge of who the key players are in that market. So this was particularly evident during COVID. So our relationships with our rights sellers and with our agents allowed us really solid, concrete evidence of what was happening in each market. Were bookstores open? Where were they buying online? What type of books were selling? Who was in a lockdown and who wasn't? So we could feed all that information back to our sales team, and as a business, understand where our opportunities were. It's also an additional service that we can extend to authors that's very hard for them to undertake themselves. This involves knowledge of IP and knowledge of copyright law, obviously. You need contracts, you need to be able to service those contracts, you need the ability to chase and collect income, And of course, this is particularly useful with self-publishing on the rise, because this is an additional service that we can offer authors. So if we can have the next slide, please. I want to tell you the story of our brilliant author, Gordon Glenister. Gordon is the author of our book, Influencer Marketing Strategy. We sold Portuguese rights to this book some time ago to a Brazilian partner of ours, absolutely brilliant partner, and they produce great books, really beautiful, well-designed books that are both a treat kind of visually and to hold, but they also sell very well digitally as well. And upon publication of this book in Portuguese, they paid for Gordon to go to Brazil for a week. They created a film about influencer marketing strategy, which premiered while Gordon was there. Tickets sold out in a minute. The premiere was attended by major Brazilian influencers, 2 of whom had over 38 million followers between them. And at the film premiere, they handed out branded boxes, which you can see Gordon holding in the bottom. They created popcorn holders that were branded to the book. They had drinks holders. They created a course from the book. And then they had Gordon teach seminars whilst he was in Brazil, and they organised a media junket. Needless to say, this does not happen for all of our books. And it's ruined Gordon's expectations for what will happen with other translations. And we don't have many partners that can offer this, but this is an absolutely stellar example of us being able to offer our author an opportunity that would never have come from any other avenue. So Gordon runs a consultancy company. This opportunity, his book, and now the translation has enabled him to really extend his reach as both as an author and a consultancy company. And without the rights sale, of course, we would never have had the opportunity to offer this. And then moving on to the importance of protecting rights. Thank you, Karina. There has never been more of a threat to IP than at the moment. There are just a few headlines here. Now, most of these are either from this year or last year. It's really important as publishers that if we're going to invest in creating content, we have got to prove our ability to protect it as well. And we've got to be able to do that as publishers, as an industry, and at policy level, because we need to be really sure that authors are confident in our ability to protect their work and their property, as well as really cementing our value as publishers. So at Kogan Page, we take a very proactive approach to removing infringing content, both on and offline. We are seeing some very inventive ways that pirates are circumventing this, but we definitely are trying to keep as on top of this as anybody can. And we work really closely with our partners, whether that's professional associations, whether that's corporates, whether that's authors, any of our partners, to really instill in them the value of IP and the importance of protection, because we need to ensure that they understand the value of any IP, whether that's created with us or created jointly. And then the next slide, please, Karina. Paul touched on this earlier, but I cannot emphasize enough the importance of systems and standards within rights selling. Paul talked about this earlier. One of the challenges in licensing is really the standardization of terms across our business. In all the publishing houses I've worked at, there's an acquisition of rights, labeling the rights type as one thing in the author contract, something else in the internal system, something totally different in the sub-licensing contract, and then something completely different on the author statement. So even seasoned rights sellers get confused, never mind people who are new to the industry or, of course, authors. So it's really important to have a good housekeeping system that standardizes this language and also is integrated with the rest of your business. This is absolutely imperative, and it needs to be automated. We cannot be manually updating records. This should all flow, if it's not within the same system, between systems seamlessly. Rights selling is little and often. We will often generate significantly more contracts than our editorial teams, and we need systems in place to ensure that everything swims through the channel as much as possible without touching the sides, which allows you time and resources to look at those special or unusual deals that take up more resource in terms of time and brain power. And it's vital that we understand what we're requiring from authors in the first place. Do we know what's in our contracts? Are editorial teams confident about the why in these contracts? Why do we need these rights? And then are we getting the best out of all the rights? Are we really maximising our selling? Or are we rights warehousing? Are we acquiring rights that we have no intention of using or no ability to sell? Licensing chunks of content is a challenge as well, and there's a place here for DOIs or digital object identifiers, really enabling us to sell discrete parts of content. And there's some complexity around territories, again leading us back to systems and back to metadata. What are we acquiring? What are we licensing, and for where? Standards can help enormously, both in the UK and globally. Of course, going back to metadata and Onyx feeds, these really help us as rights sellers to understand sales, publishing, distribution rights, what content is available, how do we articulate that to the market, how are we confident in what we've acquired and what we're able to both sell and to sub-license. Royalty statements can be a real challenge for rights and royalties teams. As sub-rights sellers, our licensees will send us royalty statements every, depending on what time period you've set up, let's say for argument's sake, annually. They will send us a statement every year of what they've sold, how many copies they've got in stock, and what the revenue owed to us is. We receive hundreds of these statements every year, all in different formats, often in PDF, with no ability to auto-ingest these. So my challenge to the industry is to invent a way of auto-ingesting these. And of course, there are significant risks involved if you cannot either secure and prove your rights management, or you cannot prove your ability to show that you own these rights. What happens if you sell rights to a product that was sold years ago? What happens if you double sell? How do you prove that you're the copyright holder? And any integration with the business allows transparency, it allows visibility to the rest of your business to really ensure that you are maximising sales opportunities and ensure that the rest of your business can have informed conversations with their authors. And then moving on to my last slide, please, Karina. It's really important as an industry that we acknowledge that rights knowledge is not just for rights staff. It's vital that everybody in the publishing industry understands the importance of copyright and understands rights systems, because the knock-on impact downstream, again, this is something that Paul spoke about earlier, means that if you're not acquiring the rights and you're not protecting and exploiting them, that means that you are missing opportunities. You are missing opportunities to make revenue. And of course, this does involve cross-departmental responsibilities, so it's really important to have shared knowledge, shared ownership. And if you don't secure the rights you need for future products, for example, audio rights, ebook rights for digital-only product, what's the future of your business? Where are you going next? What will prevent you from getting there? I've spoken about the importance of protection, and then also making sure that you're using rights knowledge in your business and your organisation, really cementing that feedback loop. Often rights sellers are your frontline staff going out into territories. Does that afford you any opportunities to open up the English language book market? Are there new authors there? What do your rights sellers know about the market? Is there a significant opportunity that you're missing out on? And then thinking a little bit about the future of rights selling. There's been a couple of forays into automated rights selling on various platforms. But to date, some of the issues seem to be that rights buyers can be very disparate. They're interested in different types of rights. So how do we ensure that we're using platforms for the promotion of books to all these different groups? And of course, selection of titles, relationships between rights sellers and publishing houses. These are long-term human relationships. They matching subjects, levels, styles with licensees. So often you'll come across a book and you'll just know that's an ideal project for X person or X licensee. We need to also think about flexibility of content. How do we purchase that content? And increasingly, some of the questions that we ask to ascertain usage in order to license has no relevance in the online world. So we need to think more about either technological solutions or our ability to understand the direction of rights licensing out. On the slide, here I want to just point out a fantastic resource that the PLS have created in conjunction with the Rights Management Group, and this is called the Rights and Licensing Hub. This is an industry tool, and it brings together a variety of different resources for publishers and anybody interested in rights management. It includes copyright FAQs, resources for other departments, as well as some fantastic courses that cover acquiring rights, introduction to rights management, and then licensing rights out. And then my final comment would just be that rights is a learning curve. No 2 days are the same. What we were licensing 20, 30 years ago has changed significantly. So we're constantly trying to understand where the opportunities are and where we go next. So it's really important that we understand what are we acquiring for our products in order to be able to license onwards. And that's it from me.
Great. Thank you, Amy. That was, yeah, fascinating. And thank you for that sort of journey through your role and the role generally of the rights team as the best job in the industry. Also, and also just bringing that back to basics as well. You can't sell what you don't own, which I know is oversimplifying the whole thing, but that's such an important point. Also, I think it was interesting to see there how the rights role interfaces with many different departments. The fact that you know there's a global focus, global knowledge, looking at how the rights team and the work they do, that they're looking for trends, and also the service to authors, in terms of exposure, sales, IP protection, and also just the proliferation of different formats and types of royalty statements. There must be something we can do between the industry standards bodies. That there must be. I'm not making any commitments, or any promises, but there must be something we can do there to simplify things. So thank you very much. Brilliant insight there into rights from publishers' perspective. So moving on. Oh, and there's a contact slide there for people that may want to get in touch for Amy. So moving on then. So now I'm going to introduce our third speaker. Final speaker today is Clare Hodder, Director at RightsZone. Claire's going to talk to us today about the importance of people, training, communications, systems and workflows in this, as we've heard, complex area, as well as providing a look at business risk and what the future holds. So Clare will be building on everything that we've heard so far. So over to you, Clare.
Thanks, Karina, and thanks to you and to BIC for inviting me to speak today. Like Paul and Amy, I feel very strongly about the role that rights has to play in the publishing value chain. And for my part of the webinar, I want to address some of the challenges involved in managing rights, not just for individual publishing businesses, but also for the industry as a whole. And Amy and Paul have alluded to many of these already, but I really think it's important to flesh those out a bit, because they're challenges that we actually need help to address. They're not things that can just be solved by people working in rights alone. So this part will be a bit of a call to action. I've worked in rights for almost my whole publishing career, and it's an area I've stayed in because, as Amy said, it offers so many possibilities. Can you move the slide on, please? Through rights and licensing, the exciting thing for me is that you can make your book be something that's so much more. So it enables a kind of shape shifting, and the content from our books can become anything from an audio recording to a cuddly toy, part of a medical database, or become a Bollywood movie. Our content might be used to develop AI technology, or it might be sampled by a music producer. There really are endless possibilities for licensing content, and that's what keeps it interesting, keeps it exciting. Since I started working as a rights consultant, I've been privileged enough to work with a huge variety of rights teams across trade, across academic and educational publishing, to help them understand and overcome some of the challenges that rights acquisition and licensing presents. In my previous role, I was Director of Rights Acquisition and Licensing at Palgrave Macmillan. And I've also worked with different software businesses and in industry bodies like the Publishers Association and Publishers Licensing Services to help them grapple with rights issues too. As Karina mentioned, I'm one of the founding partners of RightsZone. RightsZone is a cloud-based software app for rights professionals. Alongside that, I still do a bit of rights selling myself, and I am, together with my colleague Ruth Tellis, I run the Rights Together networking group. So I also sit on industry committees. I sit on the BIC Rights Committee with Paul and the PLS Rights and Licensing Group with Amy. So I think it's fair to say I'm pretty committed to rights. I'm pretty involved with rights, and I speak to a lot of rights people on a daily basis. And through those different touch points that I have with rights professionals, I think it's become really apparent that that rights is a part of the industry and a part of the value chain that's actually quite often overlooked. Next slide, please. And what's sad is that rights teams don't always enjoy the same level of investment in systems, in recruitment, in training as their sales and marketing colleagues do. Both Paul and Amy mentioned the really important contribution to bottom line profit that rights teams make, and that's not necessarily well known. And I think generally there's a bit of a lack of understanding about what rights teams actually do. Ruth and I often refer to rights as the dark arts because it's this kind of mysterious area that, you know, a team sat in the basement that nobody quite understands. And that's a real shame. There's really important roles rights professionals play in author relations, in finding and developing new markets, facilitating compliance with copyright law, reinvigorating the backlist, you know, bringing new life to books that, you know, the rest of the business has forgotten, championing the brand within the industry and beyond, as you know, as Amy mentioned in her presentation. But these things might come as a surprise to people who don't already work in rights and licensing. And I think that as rights people, we have to take some responsibility for that. I don't think we're great at self-promotion. We've not been making the case for the importance of rights strongly enough, and we haven't shared with our colleagues the kinds of complexity that we're grappling with and the implications that that can have on the rest of the business. And so for many people in publishing outside of rights teams, it's something that they don't see as integral to their daily working life, but it really is. Next slide, please. So, you know, both Paul and Amy and Karina have all mentioned, you know, rights are essential. We only have publishing businesses to the extent that publishers have acquired the rights necessary to turn content into published works, and they really do touch every single department. Editorial teams are not acquiring books, they're acquiring the right to publish content in book form. Sales are entirely dependent on the set of rights that have been acquired in order to know how and where they can make a sale, and any digital sale isn't really a sale in the traditional sense, it's a rights license. Production teams often find that there's a degree of compliance work in their role. Perhaps they've got to make sure that assignment or license to publish forms have been, have been submitted when they're publishing journal articles. Or in a book, they might have to make sure that they've got all the acknowledgement copy for any third-party items for which permission is needed to be sought. They might be thinking about whether, if they hit the button on a new print order, whether some of the rights that they've acquired have limitations in terms of number of copies that can be printed. So they come into production as well. Designers, marketing teams, web teams, they're reusing the published assets of the organisation on a daily basis, as well as using additional assets created by other people every time they produce covers, catalogues, ads, web copy, social media posts. All of that has rights implications. People involved in business development, new product innovation are entirely bound by the rights that have been acquired. And any kind of shiny new project can be thwarted instantly if the appropriate rights haven't been secured. We have contract teams that support negotiation and ensure that agreed rights are set out properly in agreements, together with arrangements for remuneration in exchange for those rights. And as Amy has demonstrated, the rights licensing teams really depend upon the set of rights enshrined in the acquisition agreements before they can start making deals to reuse the content in new ways. Royalties teams have to ensure that authors and creators are paid properly for the rights that have been granted, and Paul talked about that. And the finance department too, they have to account and budget for revenue, but the ability to drive revenue from the products that we produce is entirely dependent on the set of rights that have been obtained. And I think it's quite interesting to think about trade publishing, where agents often retain control of key rights. And that means that there can be lean periods for sales and licensing teams, because if acquisitions teams haven't been able to secure a wide or a broad range of rights, there might be territories that they suddenly can't sell large parts of the list in, or maybe translation rights sales are really curtailed, and they both not having those rights can have a really big impact on the bottom line. So in order to do proper financial forecasting, there needs to be a really good understanding of the rights that have been acquired. And so you'd think, since rights run through all parts of the publishing business, that it would make sense to take a really strategic approach to manage them. But comprehensive organisation-wide rights strategies are harder to come by than you might think. And it's really encouraging to hear Amy talking about the fact that they do have something in place at Kogan Page that covers that end-to-end process. But it's it's definitely not everywhere. And I think part of the reason for that is due to some of the complexity involved in rights. Next slide, please. So this shows just how complicated things can get. So I'm going to give you an example of a travel book. It's a travel guide to Spain. So let's imagine that the publishing teams decided to create the book in print and ebook format. They've also decided to create an app so people can reference key information on their mobile devices whilst they're traveling, and an audiobook version so people can get an audio tour of sites of interest when visiting. So the content for each of those products is going to be slightly different, and it will contain a mixture of things, a different mixture for each product. So it might have some original text from the author, some photographs, some illustrations, and perhaps some extracts from other work. There might be a recipe for paella, some quotes from Spanish poetry. There might be some flamenco music used in the audio and the app versions. And whilst the author contract will cover the original text and maybe some of the photographs, there will be other rights holders that need to be contacted to secure the rights to use those other assets. And in addition, the rights need to be secured from the narrator and the recording studio for the audio edition, the software developer who's working on the app, and from the font foundry who need to license use of the font for the print and ebook editions, as well as the designer who's worked on the cover art. So there are lots of different people who need to assign rights in order to create these products. In each case, there'll need to be a licensing agreement with the party that controls the rights, which outline the rights being granted. And it might have things about the duration of the license and any particular terms and conditions that are attached to use of their content. So having sourced, just to say, it's not uncommon to find that even just one asset has multiple rights holders. For example, if you're using text from a novel, you might find that that novel has different publishers in the UK and the US, and in order to get world rights to use the extract you want to use, you've got to approach both publishers. So it's complicated to track down rights holders to obtain agreements from all of them. And having sourced them all, you've then got to look at them really holistically to say, have we got all the rights that we need from all of these different sources to publish the products that we want to? Can we comply with all the terms and conditions that we've been given, which are all completely different? In some cases, there might be restrictions on the number of copies that can be printed, or certain format rights might be withheld. You know, if there are fees to pay, are they within budget? What acknowledgements do you need to include and where? And in some cases, terms and conditions might be too restrictive or too burdensome, and so you might need to drop content or replace it. What's scary is that if just one photo in a book has a territorial restriction, the whole book would have to be restricted for that territory. So if the recipe rights were only licensed, say, on a 2-year term, that would mean the whole book couldn't be sold after that time unless rights were re-cleared. And if you, perhaps the photographs might only have print rights associated with them, which means you then couldn't use them in an app or an ebook edition. So a small thing on a, on a license can have a big impact on the products that you can sell. And acquiring editors are having to make decisions all the time about the breadth and the quality of the content they want to include versus the implications of including content with more limited rights. And budget and human resources available to manage those things play a key part in that kind of decision making. There's a balance between needing to publish on time and within budget with more strategic kind of future-proofing approach, which would, maybe acquiring a really broad set of rights to make sure that all future uses could be catered for versus can we afford to acquire that many rights and how much time is it going to take us to negotiate all of that. So compromises often have to be made. And once all of those rights agreements have been finalised, it falls to then those various other teams that we looked at in the last slide to manage and comply with the associated terms and conditions. So making the payments, ensuring acknowledgements are included, working out what products can be sold where in terms of market restrictions, etc. So there's a really significant challenge here for publishers in managing the complex network of rights agreements across the large number of titles that they're publishing. And that complexity grows when you consider that the information about rights acquired needs to be communicated across all of the departments in the business for every publication and sometimes outside of the organisation as well. Next slide, please. So with that level of complexity, there's obviously quite a large risk of things going wrong. If you don't have good systems and processes in place to manage all of that complexity, things will get missed. People will forget to re-clear rights at the end of an agreement term. They might not remember to add that market restriction to a sales database. They might forget that they need to put acknowledgements in. They might have to remove an image from an ebook, but forget to do that and then find themselves infringing rights. And there can be quite significant implications when you get things wrong. So one example you might have heard of is a few years ago, there was a big spate of cases brought by photographers against educational textbook publishers because various publishers had exceeded license terms when using photographs. So they cleared rights to reuse photographs in their first edition. They went on to reprint rights. They went on to reprint their textbooks over and over again. The license with the photographer only lasted for the first printing and not beyond. So they were immediate, every time they did a reprint, they were infringing rights. Additionally, they created different versions of their textbooks for different markets, different language versions, etc. And again, didn't clear any additional permission to do that. So there've been huge, huge implications for that. Scary damages awarded because of the sort of scale of the infringement, and lots of publishers settling out of court before things got that far because they could see just how financially damaging this could be. So there's a clear risk there. And the other thing I think that both Paul and Amy have talked about is, if you don't manage your rights carefully, how do you know if you can take advantage of new opportunities and experiment with emerging business models? You need to have information and data about your rights that you can interrogate quickly in order to make sure that you grasp those opportunities quickly when they come along. And lack of access to good rights data, good contractual information is a real frustration for rights and licensing teams. Although most publishers have digitised author contracts, there are often gaps in agreements covering third-party works and other kinds of commissioned assets that haven't come directly from an author. The time taken to establish rights availability means that opportunities and revenue can be lost very quickly, and there's a lot of deals that could be done in time better spent than people faffing around trying to find rights information. There's a reputational risk as well, not only because keeping people waiting for licenses is not great, but also, you know, if you're infringing rights, having negative news stories, having to publish errata or apologies for oversights, you know, IP infringement's really not a good look for businesses that rely on that same IP protection for their livelihood. And there's harm too when we need to protect the IP that we've acquired. Amy mentioned this a bit, but I know that there are some examples from the Publishers Association where they've tried to stamp out piracy in certain territories, and they've come back to publishers to ask for evidence of chain of title. So that's sort of, you know, basically a chain of contracts that proves, you know, who has the rights at any given time. And many publishers just can't provide that. So then that hampers those enforcement efforts. It's also problematic when it comes to lobbying for protection of IP. You know, when we're talking to governments, you know, our credibility in arguing that copyright is fit for purpose risks being seriously undermined if our actions evidence that even we as publishers are not making it work. And again, I think Paul mentioned this, it's worth thinking about the impact on how your business is valued. Amy mentioned the Rights and Licensing Hub, and there's a really good case study on there from Natalina Bertoli from Bertoli Mitchell, who talks about how, you know, mergers and acquisition deals can come unstuck because of inaccurate or missing rights information. So that's worth checking out. Next slide, please. So I hope that it's clear from what we've all spoken about today why rights are a critical and, not to mention, a complex part of the value chain. There's so much more that we can do to derive value from the rights that we have, but in order to do that, we need to work across several fronts. As I said earlier, I think rights has been underinvested in and undervalued for many years, and we need to start making that right. We need to be making the case to publishing executives that taking holistic strategic approaches to rights acquisition and licensing matters to our industry, and it has potential to bring significant rewards as well as helping us to reduce risk. We need them to put their hands in their pockets and invest in change. To manage complexity across all of our content assets and all of our products, we really do need modern, flexible systems that allow us to record rights information, communicate it widely, and interrogate it and analyse it quickly so that we can be responsive to market opportunities and drive innovation. We need good rights metadata to underpin that, and that has to be consistent. Amy mentioned the problems of people not having, not using the same terminology within businesses. That really gets worse when we go beyond our own business. When mergers and acquisitions happen, people will have all sorts of different versions of contracts, all with different kind of terminology. It's not very clear what anyone means, you know, because there's no standards. So we absolutely are crying out for comprehensive standards that will help us to manage the flow of rights more efficiently. And just as Onyx transformed book distribution, so new standards for rights transactions could revolutionise IP and licensing. And certainly if we want to transition to new models, for example, by transacting rights in the blockchain, then rights standards are going to be really essential. We need a greater understanding of rights and the role they play in our business across all publishing departments, an appreciation of copyright law, an understanding of the flow of rights through the organisation, and awareness of the implications of getting rights wrong should all be part of the core training and the education provision for those working in publishing. And we need to think beyond our own organisations, collaboration with our creators and their agents, with allied creative industries, with licensees and with users of our content will help us to develop sensible rights management strategies that work for all parts of the value chain. Next slide. So just finally to say that I think if we can achieve some of those things, then the future looks bright. I won't go into detail there, you can see the headlines on the screen, but just to say that rights really is a key part of the value chain, and we need to we need to work hard to make sure it delivers all of the value that it can for the publishing industry, because at the moment there's definitely quite a bit of untapped potential. So thanks for listening. If Karina, you can put up the next slide, there's a couple of links on there that you might find useful, including the link to the Rights and Licensing Hub that Amy showed the screens for. And do get in touch if this is something you'd like to know more about. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, very clear there what the challenges for the industry are with regards to rights, and definitely a call to action that's coming through loud and clear. And again, reinforced there from you is the importance of the rights team. You know, looking at new markets, bringing life to the backlist, establishing new markets, etc. But also, and then a real, hopefully loud and clear message to everyone about the importance of getting it right, or should I say the importance of not getting it wrong. Both mean the same thing, but I think the latter is probably a bit more hard hitting. So we mustn't be getting it wrong, but we can't know if we're getting it wrong if we don't have the right systems and processes and information in place. So and then really in your point there about how anti-piracy efforts can be hindered by not having those systems and processes and knowledge easily to hand and in one place. So that's definitely food for thought there. So thank you very much. I'm just going to, right, so now it's Q&A, but we are quite over time, so we've got 4 minutes. So I'm just going to check if there are any questions in the question box. Let me just bring up the camera there as well. So let's just see if we have any questions. Nothing yet. Everyone's been quite shy. So I've got a few. I've just been making some notes. So while people are thinking about what to ask, given that we don't have very long, so one of my first questions then will be, we've talked a bit here, well, quite a bit about new models emerging. So I would invite the panel to talk a little bit about what they're, if they're able to, what models they're seeing coming up. What models do we have now that perhaps we didn't have, I don't know, 20 years ago?
I'll start. Subscriptions would be you know, a significant new model where, you know, its content is now being made available along with other content, and there has to be some allocation to the authors for their contribution to an overall subscription.
And in terms of types of sort of future-proofing, are we seeing more sort of film and TV, more sort of digital focus than before, or does it tend to be sort of the same sort of types of?
There's definitely been a change. Amy said the licensing that was being done 20, 30 years ago is not the same licensing as being done now. You know, then you might have been doing really big serial deals, you might have had book club deals. They're virtually dead in the water now, but we are seeing audio is huge. So obviously that depends if you do in-house audio, if you're going to license out. And film and TV with all the streaming services is definitely getting bigger as well. I mentioned Bollywood movie in my presentation, and that's because I know one academic publisher who has optioned Bollywood film rights to an academic monograph, which I think is really cool. So there are loads of possibilities.
Okay, thank you. And what can publishers do to improve visibility across their business of rights owned, rights permitted, rights available, rights in, rights out, that type of thing?
I think
I've got so many thoughts.
Yeah,
I think the most important thing is to start talking to your whole staff about the importance of rights, the importance of rights management, and what it stops you from doing. But I think it's really important to have visibility, so as rights sellers to be feeding back to the business about what you're doing, what kind of activities, what kind of licensing, success stories, and kind of weekly sales, because I think that gets your buy-in from the rest of the business. You know, financial investment, the more that you invest in systems and processes and resources, hopefully the more money you make, which will then kind of raise your profile within the business. So I think it is, it does sort of go round. But I think Claire made some great points about, you know, investment and in about systems, etc.
Yeah, see things like putting it in people's objectives, like to kind of learn about rights, or to the things that they have to be responsible for their part of the chain, you know, that they're really enshrined, and people kind of don't think about it as something that's not part of their job, but that's intrinsic to it.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And interesting, the conversation, you know, we've been talking a lot about authors and the service to authors. I think that's something I think that can be played, that should be played up as well. What other author opportunities? We talked about, Amy, you talked about your author there who had this, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I know they were huge. Their tickets selling out in 2 seconds or something, or in a minute, to his event. So what other author opportunities do you think there might be coming out of closer and better and more informed rights management? Obviously, without giving away any of your own company's secrets.
I think it's about where you can take that content. Particularly with business authors, you know, we're working with people who are going out and doing exciting and interesting things. Where are the opportunities there? What new products might that afford you the ability to get into? Paul's talked about subscription, we've talked about digital licensing. I've yet to find a company that will make films of business books, but you know, we would like to explore all opportunities, so we won't knock that in the head. But it is also thinking about, you know, what's coming. You know, when people are developing apps and, you know, all sorts of clever technology, where's our kind of industry opportunity for our content in there?
Yeah, great. Paul, did you want to add anything?
No, that's good. That covers it. Yep.
Have I got time to ask a question to Paul, Karina?
Yes, go for it. Quickly.
One of the things that really struck a chord with me Paul, was when you said that editorial colleagues had a great imagination when they were negotiating their contracts. And to what extent do you think they can and should be reined in so that we can put everything into neat boxes that can be streamlined and easy for everyone to understand?
My recommendation to publishers is that it be based on the value of the deal. Now, clearly, if you have an author who's going to be a #1 bestseller, then you will jump through hoops in order to accommodate their terms. However, you know, once you get down into the B list and the C list, so to speak, where there really shouldn't be that much variation, or it should be well justified based on the financial picture, what the projected P&L is going to be, because I think there's a lot of hidden costs involved in having special deals. The hidden costs are literally at every aspect, from the contract signing through X years of paying royalties and answering questions from the author that are now different than everything else. So, you know, so I think publishers often don't, they underestimate what the real cost is of special deals. So,
yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
And having converted many deals from many systems, we've seen some very interesting, you know, arrangements having been made. You know, and you know, God forbid that, you know, you make an arrangement where now you've got to do a spreadsheet in order to produce a royalty statement, because you're now absorbing that cost in a person to do that work for X years. It's a real cost. It should be a line item in the P&L, to be honest, if that's the case.
I'm getting that message loud and clear.
Yep.
Okay, we are out of time. We should have scheduled this for 2 hours, I know, but we are where we are. So I will, if I may, just sum up, if that's even possible. So I've written loads of notes, but I'm not going to have time to go through all of them. So it's very obvious, we've heard today that rights are a key part of the value chain of our industry. IP is the foundation of our industry, and publishing is turning, you can argue that the whole book industry, the whole publishing industry is about turning rights into published works. I think that was quoting you, Claire. We've heard about the importance to, you know, how important it is to protect IP, but not only to be able to protect it, but to be able to demonstrate that you can and that you're able to protect it. You know, for many reasons. One for sort of confidence from your authors, but also in your fights against piracy, to be able to demonstrate that you know that you own the IP, that you have the rights, that you are the person that is you know is rightly fighting a particular pirate or pirates. We've heard about rights in, rights out, what they mean, the different types, and we've looked at managing the licensing life cycle, including all of its complexities, and knowing about the different levels and multiple rights options and types that are out there. We've looked at contracts, royalties, payments. We've talked about an inventory of rights. And Paul, you said a deal is the building block for any rights transaction, which I thought was a great quote. The importance of consistency in terms of terminology and standards and automation to make everyone's lives easier, but also to afford greater visibility and transparency all the way along that chain. And that goods rights management and communications and sharing of that information up front will protect the content of the work, or the book, the published work, etc. And will also free up a lot of time in the development of that product as well. We've heard the importance of not getting it wrong, and what the terrible ramifications for getting it wrong can be, and the importance of transparency throughout the whole process, not only to the organisation concerned, but also to the authors or the multiple rights holders for that work. Rights as an asset value, and the importance of having a rights strategy as well. So in all, I think, you know, that, and Claire, to your point about, you know, this is a call to action, a call to the industry to perhaps think a little bit more closely about rights and just sort of gain a greater understanding of what your rights team can do, how important rights are, and the value that those departments and those skills and knowledge in that area can bring. So I hope I haven't missed anything. So I'm going to close the event now, so just bear with me. So just to finalise, just a bit of housekeeping at the end here. We are out of time. I'm sorry we've run over, but I think it was a very interesting discussion. But we are at the end of today's session. We're going to make the presentation slides available on our website as soon as we can, and the recording of the webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel, which you had the link for earlier on today. But we'll contact all the attendees today and share those links with you when they're available. They should be up sometime next week. If you're keen to stay up to date with BIC and the work we do, please do think about joining our mailing list. The link is there, and as is the link to our website. Finally, I would like to say thank you to our attendees for coming along today. And thank you to our speakers, of course, on behalf of BIC and everyone here. I'd like to say thank you to Paul, to Amy and Claire for taking the time out not only to be here today to share your expertise, but also for taking the time out. I'm very well aware that presentations take a lot of prep, take a lot of rehearsing, etc. So thank you for that time that you've given there as well. And I would like to thank our sponsor, FADEL, who have helped to make this event possible today. To our attendees, I'd like to say thank you for joining us. Please do stay in touch. And you can find out more about BIC and the work we do via our website. And we hope to see you at a BIC event in the future. Take care until then. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.